Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair, and to the final week of Blockbuster Month, although at this point that name's a bit of a misnomer since we stretched it out into July due to production delays. So it's more like Blockbuster Month in a few weeks. But that's okay, because this episode is sort of a mistake as well. Due to critical research failure on my part, namely because my original intent for Blockbuster Month was to include Mario Puzo's The Godfather, but after 5 years of Classic Novel Month, I learned my lesson on picking 3 normal-length books and 1 really long book, so I was kind of reaching for anything I could find to fill the gap, and 2001 seemed like a good choice, also because it sort of ties into an unofficial theme that I didn't realize until writing this episode, that this entire month has featured books that kinda tie back in some ways to my earlier classic novel months. Jaws ties back into Moby Dick, Forrest Gump ties back into Flowers for Algernon, Roger Rabbit doesn't have an obvious tie-in, but the murder mystery with a surprise ending is sorta like Fight Club, and then 2001: A Space Odyssey is very similar to Planet of the Apes, in that it's a classic sci-fi story made into a classic sci-fi film. And then the production delays tie back into 2014, where I was forced to delay the end of that theme month into July as well. But you're not here to listen to me reminisce about my past. My point is that I picked 2001, unaware that the novel and the film were actually developed concurrently, and so there's no direct adaptation involved. Whoopsie. But I'm stubborn, so we're gonna do it anyway. Though instead of our usual checkup to see what was changed and the purposes of adaptation, I'm going to look at the differences in how Clarke and Kubrick expanded on the same story, The Sentinel of Eternity, originally written for a contest, which it lost, and later published in a sci-fi magazine. Years later, Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick decided to work together on adapting some of Clarke's stories into a movie, and they took The Sentinel and adapted it and elements from other stories to create 2 distinct versions of 2001: A Space Odyssey. The short story basically only features 2 astronauts finding a very old tetrahedron on the moon that requires a great effort to uncover, and one astronaut theorizes that its purpose was to warn other spacefaring species once the Earth and its people became sufficiently advanced, but it bears little resemblance to the fleshed-out stories in either the novel or the film. In fact, this was a point of contention for Clarke himself, as he stated in a piece for the magazine Heavy Metal in 1984, nearly 2 decades after the release of the film. I am continually annoyed by careless references to The Sentinel as the story on which 2001 is based. It bears about as much resemblance to the movie as an acorn to the resultant full-grown oak, considerably less in fact because ideas from several other stories are also incorporated. Even the elements that Stanley Kubrick and I did actually use were considerably modified, thus the glittering, roughly pyramidal structure set in the rock like a gigantic many-faceted jewel became, after several modifications, the famous black monolith, and the locale was moved from the Mare Crisium to the more spectacular of all lunar craters, Tycho, easily visible to the naked eye from Earth at full moon. Thus, I will not be covering the short story as our point of comparison, though I will say that I read it and it's pretty good, although not quite as fleshed out as I would have liked. Guess that's why it didn't win the contest, right? To compare, I'm going to use the novelization and focus on the way that Clarke, an author, and Kubrick, an auteur, differed despite working on the same story. Anyway, let's take a spaceship to Saturn and get into 2001: A Space Odyssey. Iota, run intro.
I'm afraid I can't do that, Dave.
What's the problem, and why are you calling me Dave?
Dave's not here, man.
Who the hell is Dave? The cover is, well, to be honest, most of the covers are basically the movie poster or a generic space image. My edition is recent, so it's just the moon. Though I will give credit where it's due, I absolutely love how A Space Odyssey is overlaid over the 2001 at the top. Most other covers include images from the film, like this edition where we see Space Station 5, or this one that goes all in on the film on the wraparound dust jacket. Not particularly amazing, but Clark by that point was pretty prolific, so you're buying it based on name value. Or by value of the movie, which is equally prolific. On to the story. The story comes to us in 3 parts. The book itself is divided into 6, but I consider it 3 because the last 3 parts focus on the same characters, so they're part of a single POV. You have the opening, where the first monolith is sent to Earth and influences the evolution of the ape-descended life forms, including Moonwatcher, that live there, giving Moonwatcher's tribe the idea and brain capacity to use tools and strategy, therefore setting the stage for humanity to come into existence several centuries later. Following that, we skip ahead thousands of years into the late 20th century, circa 1999, where not only is the Cold War still ongoing, with the USSR and US still fighting, but they both have orbiting nuclear warheads floating in space. Seems like a bad place to put them, since they're really close to the Earth, but that's just me. Dr. Haywood Floyd is going up to the moon to investigate a strange finding that the scientists up there made, which is being kept very hush-hush by the US government as to not raise any suspicion. Though a fat lot of good that's did, because before he leaves, Floyd is inundated with reporters and colleagues asking about why there's an information blackout on the moon. Though I'm admittedly a little pessimistic. Last time a Haywood went to the moon, it didn't end so well. There's also a humorous scene where Floyd, noticing a colleague while making a video call back to Earth, trying very hard to dodge him before the friend notices him anyway and chases him down. When he arrives on the moon, we're introduced to the reason for the blackout. The scientists discovered another monolith, though naturally they don't know about the first one from the beginning of the book, on the moon, and were attempting to date it to find out who put it there, the likely culprit being their Chinese rivals. However, after looking it over, the scientists figure out that it's really old, like really old, and has likely been there longer than humans have existed. The scientists unearth it enough that the monolith sees sunlight for the first time, possibly ever, and when it does, it emits a signal that's sent halfway across the solar system, with several probes and satellites picking up a disturbance on Saturn. A space mission is prepped led by Dave Bowman and Gary Mitchell, Frank Poole, and 3 other astronauts in suspended animation. Bowman and Poole are there to keep an eye on things during the long journey while they wait for the ship, Discovery 1, to make it to Saturn. Yes, I said Saturn. In the movie it was Jupiter, but Clark used Saturn, which I guess is because of the rings that make it a more interesting setting to describe. Plus, there's a precedence for weird celestial activities going on there, since they are the rings of time after all. Just ask Captain Kirk. For the most part, the journey is rather bland, with Poole and Bowman going about their business, attending to small repairs, and living out their days, and interacting with the ship's computer, HAL 9000, who has an IQ of 6,000, the same as 6,000 PE teachers. Oh, wait a minute, that's not right. HAL 9000 is an AI created by the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation with a GPP, which stands for Genuine People Personality, and shoot, that's not right either, is it? HAL 9000 is the ship's computer, capable of passing the Turing test and containing essentially the sum of human knowledge, even having emotional quirks that a computer probably shouldn't have. On the way, they drop a probe on Jupiter, and it appears to find interesting stuff, but in between the probe and their arrival at Saturn, things start to go weird. First off, HAL tells them to repair a fault in one of the antenna's components, the AE-35, the antenna being their only link with Earth, so if that breaks, they're kinda screwed. After checking in with Mission Control, they're authorized to fix it, and Poole goes out to replace it on an EVA. Bringing the faulty unit back inside reveals that it's not broken. So there's one of 2 possibilities. Either the fault is so specific that only HAL can predict it, which is unlikely, or HAL has developed a fault in his predictive algorithm. Personally, I think it's the latter, because Bowman keeps getting targeted ads for FarmersOnly.com. They contact Earth, who tell them that they should disconnect HAL and allow the Earthbound HAL unit to take control, since that unit will be supervised by Mission Control, and Bowman and Poole discuss the shutdown away from HAL, but since he's kinda the ship, He's sort of everywhere. The next morning, Hal sends Poole out on a mission to replace another faulty AE-35 unit. When he goes out, Hal activates his pod while he's in EVA, and Poole's body is dragged away from Discovery 1, heading for Saturn. Bowman is none too pleased, and he tells Hal to wake up the rest of the hibernated crew. Hal does so, but he also opens the airlocks. Listen, Hal, I know he said to open the pod bay doors, but that was overkill. And if you thought I was going to go for the low-hanging red dwarf joke, you're absolutely right.
Everybody's dead, Dave.
Bowman escapes the vacuum and sneaks into a spacesuit, heading for Hal's central computer system. Hal attempts to explain the seriousness of the mission and how Hal is the most important crew member, and he can't allow Bowman or anyone else to jeopardize the mission. Bowman ignores Hal and disconnects his higher functions, causing his mind to degrade like Charlie Gordon's at the end of Flowers for Algernon. Hey, another connection! Before it finally goes, with him singing Daisy Bell by Harry Dacre. Bowman finally gets back in contact with Earth, and Heywood Floyd explains the real objective of the Saturn mission, to find the second monolith on Saturn, and tells Bowman that he's their only hope in achieving their goal of finding out what the deal is. When Bowman arrives on Saturn, he finds the second monolith, which is much larger than the first one. Bowman studies it for a bit before he decides to go check it out in one of the pods. When he approaches it, he's pulled into the monolith, which for a short time becomes a void. This leads into the, my god, it's full of stars scene. The monolith, it turns out, is a Stargate. Not any of those. Wow, Stargate rivals Star Trek with the amount of spin-offs, eh? The monolith, when placed by the beings that influenced Earth's evolution, was designed to transport a human to another part of the universe, and deposits Bowman in a hotel room. Now, this isn't the case of the aliens being future humans or something. It's more like that crappy TNG episode, The Royale, where an astronaut landed on an advanced planet that created a simulation of a crappy pulp story. In this case, the place can read Bowman's mind and creates a place that will put him at maximum ease. So an Earth hotel room fit the bill. He falls asleep and he never wakes up. Because when he falls asleep, he enters the next stage of human evolution. See, the beings that placed the monoliths and organized this whole thing, they evolved past corporealness centuries ago and became one with the universe, so they kickstart man's next stage and turn Bowman into a star baby. And in the final act of the novel, Bowman travels back to Earth and detonates an orbiting nuclear warhead that was about to explode before going off on another star baby adventure. Obviously, a major change is that Discovery 1 goes to Jupiter and not Saturn in the movie. According to Clark, that was because the production had trouble creating Saturn's rings with the technology of the time, so they just shifted it to Jupiter and cut out the probe stuff. Another major change is that the stuff involving Moonwatcher, which was a mostly visual scene in the film with no dialogue and lasted about 10 minutes, the version in the book is a lot more cerebral, with a lot more insight into the primitive minds of the ape men. There's also some more insight into Heywood Floyd's head during his trip into space. Again, Kubrick tended to do more visual exposition, as is common with visual mediums, so we lose a lot of the clarity, but gain interesting visuals. James Blish, who is actually an authority on novelization since he novelized every episode of Star Trek the original series, actually said in his review of the book that while the movie is more visually impressive and more poetic and symbolic, the book, and I quote, has to be read before one can understand the picture, which I actually agree with. The movie is a classic, but it's very ambiguous and you don't really know what's going on at any given time. I've seen the movie twice at this point, and I'm not really sure what happened since a lot of the movie is instrumental or silent. But after reading the book provided important context to certain scenes. That hotel room scene, visually stunning, but Clark provides context and inner monologue from Bowman that makes the events clearer than Kubrick did. Much like how people only really remember Bowman and HAL 9000 from the movie, the most important characters in the book are Bowman and HAL, for obvious reasons, though we get a lot of insights into Moonwatcher and Floyd that we didn't get in the film. In fact, there's a huge deviation between the book and the movie that I didn't mention before because I wanted to go over it in the character section. In the film, space travel and all the various amenities are seen as dull and boring, especially to Floyd, who finds the entire business tedious. However, in the novel, he's extremely enamored with all the minute details, which some have taken to mean that he's representative of Clark himself, since Clark was enthusiastic about sci-fi stuff like that, and I really enjoyed it. The stuff with Moonwatcher is also really fascinating, because it provides a certain context to that awakening, and while it's pure fantasy, as an amateur anthropologist, I find stuff like that amazing. So I'm happy that it was included. It's a visually stunning sequence in the movie, but I don't know if I ever really cared about the apes until reading the book. Of the latter half of the story, Bowman is the one that the reader ends up sympathizing with the most, given that he is the last survivor and the reader ends up in his head for most of it. There's also this neat bit right after they introduce Bowman. He wakes up from a hibernation test with some disembodied voice calling him Dave. If you've seen the movie, you assume that it's Hal, but it's actually Poole. And it's a clever misdirection that really only happens if you've seen the movie, but who hasn't? And I also like the way that both space travelers, Bowman and Poole, were distinct from each other, and even though Poole isn't really around all that long before he dies, Clark managed to make me care about him enough that it hurt when Hal murdered him. Though, that might also be because I had to read about Gary Lockwood getting killed in space again. Not so much with the hibernated scientist, but that was more horrific than sad. Hal himself is a very interesting character as well. The book goes into more detail. The movie gave us rogue AI, and that was sort of the reasoning, but the book tells us that Hal's behavior was because of a conflict in his program. He had to keep the true mission a secret, which caused an improper belief that the humans were a threat to the mission. It makes his death all the more sadder, especially because the HAL unit on Earth didn't malfunction, so we know that this was an avoidable fault and not a general HAL issue. Clark is great with the characters and manages to give each one a distinct voice and has the unique ability to make me care about characters I've just met and makes me feel like they're old friends. Arthur C. Clarke is a gifted author, and the book, while long, was never dull or boring. It took me a fair amount of time to read, but that's just because of how in-depth it is. And I have to commend it for commenting on nearly all sci-fi conventions. AI, human evolution, space travel, nuclear war. All this before humanity had even set foot on the moon. Book came out a year shy of Apollo 11 and Aldrin, Armstrong, and Collins. Bet you thought I wasn't going to mention the pilot. There's a lot of exposition, but it's never given in a way that makes the story feel slow and plodding. The plot is always moving forward, and it's a great read. Hell, I was starting to feel all caged up and alone like Bowman did while reading, despite the fact that I did the majority of my reading on crowded subway trains. That's an accomplishment. Although now that I think about it, it may explain the strange looks I've been getting recently. My point is, while not a breezy read, it isn't hard to get invested in, and it's a delightful experience, with twists and turns that will surprise even those who saw the film. 2001: Space Odyssey is a classic film and one of Kubrick's best. But 2001: The Novel is even better. The novel is basically the movie plus a whole new context for the events, given that the monolith actually has a personality. And it's interesting to see how Kubrick went for spectacle over substance, which for his purposes worked, but I'll take substance any day as long as it's the same caliber as Clark did with his story. I highly recommend this book. If you've seen 2001, you absolutely must read it if you haven't already. And if you're a sci-fi fan, you can't get much better sci-fi than this. 2001 is to hard sci-fi what The Hitchhiker's Guide is to sci-fi comedy. And if you know my feelings on The Hitchhiker's Guide, you know how high that praise is. And I really can't think of a better way to close out Blockbuster Month. Well, apart from closing it out on the week I intended to. Next week, however, a little spider told me that a certain movie came out last week, and given that its success might warrant a third installment, why don't we take a look back at the last time our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man got a third movie? See you next time, true believers. Did I sync? I think I synced. I don't think I synced.